Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for Stepping Up, Coaching Leaders to Go to the Next Level. We're really excited to have you here. So my name is Lucy Sullivan, and I'm going to be the host for today. And before we get into our great content, I'll just cover a little bit of the housekeeping stuff. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with Zooming by now, but we're recording today's webinar. You will get a link to the recording. You'll get a link to the slides. We also do a blog post that has like a summary of sort of the key points that we covered. It has some Q&A with Trisha, who's our presenter today. So you'll get all of that after the webinar. So of course we have a big group with us today. It's a webinar. Everybody's, in listen only mode and your cameras are off, but we absolutely want to hear from you during the webinar. We're a very conversational group here and we love a lot of give and take. So please, anytime you have a question as they come to you, just pop those right in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Those will come to me, whether it's logistical, whether it's about the content, just throw those in anytime. You don't need to wait for the breaks. We will take a couple breaks for Q&A during the presentation. So we'll get to some of those, and the ones that we don't get to during the broadcast today, we'll make sure to follow up. So again, just throw those in anytime. And I will now give you just a quick introduction of who MRG is in case you're joining us new, and who's going to be taking through our content today. So MRG, Management Research Group, we're a global leader in designing assessments that impact people in profound and meaningful ways. And we have solutions for leadership, motivation, personal development, sales, service. They're insightful, they're research-backed instruments. You'll see some of the results of our research, of course, today. And they have action-inspiring feedback, and they're really just designed to foster a really deep sense of self-awareness and encourage people to make lasting change and growth. We were founded, nearly 40 years ago now, and our assessments have been used by thousands of certified practitioners around the world in more than 100 countries. We're available in many languages, over 1 million assessment participants. So it's a lot of data. So you will get the results of some of that research today. And who you will get it from is Trisha Naddaff. She's our president here at MRG. And she's been working with individuals, teams, organizations for more than 30 years in consulting and coaching since she was 10. She has been doing product design research, all aspects of the business. She also shares MRG research and learnings around the world. She presents here in Maine, she presents around the globe. She's been a TEDx speaker. You may have seen her ATD. She's contributed to Association of Coaching magazine. She's really eager to share our knowledge and our research and her experience in a lot of places. So you may have seen her speak before. So that's who you'll be hearing from today. And with that, I will hand it right on over to Trisha.
Thanks, Lucy. Hello, everybody. For those of you who are in the States and are acknowledging Happy Veterans Day, a day of celebrating people who've been of service in some aspect of our military. So welcome. I was just telling Lucy when we came on, I really love this topic. We're doing more and more work in supporting leaders in a whole variety of sectors. And I think over the course of this pandemic, one of the patterns that we've seen is as work has become more complex, because of course we've layered on an already sort of very vibrant work world, this idea of how are we navigating leadership through this pandemic? How are we contemplating changes in ways of working? How are we navigating the exit and transitions that people have made as a result of this? And so we're seeing a lot more leaders who are transitioning into the next level of leadership as these pressures and organizational changes happen. So as you know, if you've been hanging around us, we have research on many of the leadership questions, and certainly what we're going to share with you today, research on what we're learning about what's required in terms of shifts in approaches to leadership as leaders go from being successful and even being seen as having a lot of potential at one level to being successful at the next. So we're going to talk about that as sort of the grounding of our conversation. And then we're going to talk about the most challenging shift, which is from middle to senior level, and what's required to actually make that change in a successful way. And we're going to share with you how challenging that is, both in terms of the shift that's required, as well as some research that's not ours, but on actually what percentage of leaders actually are successful in making that shift to that senior level. But of course, we won't leave you hanging. We will share a number of things that we and others have learned are helpful when we're helping leaders make that transition to the next level of leadership. So if you've been with us in other webinars, you know we like to level set with a poll. So let's start with getting an idea as a learning community about how frequently you're working with leaders who are transitioning from one leadership level to another. So are you surrounded by them right now? So almost everywhere you look, is it pretty regularly that you are seeing it? Is it only occasionally, or are you really not seeing it very much right now? So give us a sense of where you are in terms of how much you're immersed in this space, either because you're in an organization and leaders around you are transitioning to some degree, or you're a coach or consultant, and the degree to which your coaching is in support of leaders making a transition from one place to another. I will tell you, as you're voting, we are, I would say probably 85% of our coaching right now is helping leaders navigate through a change in level. So it's very active in our world right now. So I will have a lot to share.
Thanks,
You're getting
Tricia.
close,
Thanks,
Lucy.
everyone. Yeah, we've got a nice group of participants here. So let me pull those results up.
Great.
Yes,
Yes,
definitely looks like it's a big part of people's world right now.
It's not surprising. I think that the upheaval, you know, the just pandemic upheaval overall, people both leaning in and out of work, and organizations shifting to accommodate for different ways of working, or at least experimenting with different ways of working. I think we're in a higher level of transitioning than we are in, can we even say this, normal times? All right, so let's jump in and explore what we can look at. And so we'll start with, let's share the research about moving from one place to another. So what we really did with this research is we looked at high potential leaders from one level and what they needed to do to become a highly effective leader at another level. So why did we do this? We structured it this way because our thinking was, if somebody's been tapped, is seen as being a high potential at one level, we're assuming that the people around them are thinking they have the best chance of being successful at that next level, right? So you're designated as a high potential. That's a vote of confidence in your ability to be successful in the next move. So we looked at that at 3 different levels, right? We looked at it going from individual contributor to first line manager, from first line manager to middle manager, and from middle manager to senior manager. For those of you who are familiar with our LEA assessment, you will know this as a leadership impact question that is asked by all the observers who complete the 360 version of our assessment. For those of you who may not be familiar, our LEA assessment, it has 2 components. It has a behavioral component and it has a competency component. And this is one of the key competencies we measure, the degree to which the observers perceive this individual as having a high potential. And so what we did was we looked at each of the levels that we were looking at the high potentials. We looked only at the people who got the top 10% of scores on this. So really high, let's call them high potentials in this category. How did we define high effectiveness at the next level? So in that second part of our assessment questionnaire, we have 30 competencies that observers complete. And so what we were looking at here is really this total effectiveness. So we were looking at how do you get to the highest in effectiveness, and we measured that by the people who got the top 10% scores across all 30 of these competencies. So we're really looking at cream of the crop in terms of high potential to get to cream of the crop in terms of effectiveness. So we can really see what that transition would look like. So the first one we looked at, again, high potential at that individual contributor level. So no managerial responsibility at that space, to becoming a highly effective first line manager. What does it take to do that? So the first space here is really 9 behavior changes that you need to make. And I want to just, for those of you who don't know about the LEA measures 22 different leadership behaviors, all of which can be more or less important depending upon the environment you're in, the goals you have, and the resources you have to achieve those goals. So what we're looking at this transition is, in order to go from highly leader who is seen as having a lot of high potential to go to this highly effective first line manager, of the 22 behaviors, there are 9 that need to be shifted. Now, one of the things that I think has been really helpful about this research is reminding us that shifts in effectiveness don't just come from doing more of something in the leadership role. They also come from turning down the usage of some behaviors. So it really is looking at leadership through a different lens, taking a different perspective, understanding that the pattern of behaviors that is needed to be successful at the next level is quite different than the pattern that you use to be successful where you are. So I'm going to describe this to you in sort of non-LEA, non-assessment language, so everybody can have access to it. But I want to just reinforce sort of a psychological framework we need to keep in mind. If somebody is seen at any level as a high potential leader, they've been told that in ways direct and indirect, that they're really good, that what they're doing is valued, and what they're doing is so good that the people around them can imagine them going further and being successful. So there's a mindset shift that has to happen in each of these transitions, which is, boy, they really think I'm awesome, but I'm really going to have to change in order to get that awesome label at the next level. And I don't think for many leaders that change in requirement to be successful is very explicitly stated, which is why we'll talk about some of the things that are critical to help leaders make this transition as we get to the end. All right, so you've got a high potential individual contributor, lot invested. We think this person's going to be really terrific moving forward, moving into the first line supervisor role, and we want to get them on a path so that they can be really effective. So there are some things that we know from the research. If they want to be an effective first line supervisor, from where they're coming from, they need to do a few things differently. They need to delegate. Of course, if you're an individual contributor, your ability to delegate is limited. So you probably haven't exercised that muscle very much. So there's probably some basic skill development that needs to happen. A big challenge with this is individual contributors are often used to being individual superstars. Like, whatever I touch turns to gold. It's my efforts that yield my success. So there is not only a skill set development requirement, but also a mindset shift. Now you are responsible for other people's success as well. And that can be psychologically and from an ego perspective, a challenging shift. They need to think cautiously and manage risk more frequently than they do. So one of the things I want to encourage us to stay mindful of, hopefully you can see the image of the volume button in the imagery behind on this slide, because what is important is we are not talking about on-off switches here. We're talking about do something a little bit more, do something a little bit less. So it's one of the reasons I think coaching is so helpful in these transitions, because it is a moderation of more or less rather than a start and stop. So the think cautiously and manage risk is because the individual contributors tend to be pretty high on innovative as we measure in the LEA. So thinking in new and different ways, taking some risks. They're sort of the lone rangers out there in the workplace field, right? So, but now they've got a system in place, they've got people that are reporting to them, and they need to be a little bit more cautious, think through things a little bit more. They also need to defer to authority. One of the things, again, that happens with individual contributors is they're a little bit outside of the organizational structure in terms of hierarchy. And they tend to, quite frankly, actually get away with a little bit more if they're really high performers. So now, though, you're in the managerial line and decisions are going to come down that you have to impart to your direct reports that you might not always agree with, and you're no longer a free agent. So you've got to sort of walk the line a little bit more. Again, moderately more, not not always abiding by. You can challenge the status quo, but you're going to need to align a little bit more than you did when you were an individual contributor. You need to be more organized. You are now responsible for a body of work that extends beyond you. So the ability to look around and see what policies, procedures, rules, processes, guidelines actually help a unit operate more effectively is going to need to be more in play. Being more consensual, so asking for and using the input of others. Again, moving out of that more free agent space, a little bit more out of taking your own counsel and really working with others and taking advantage of others' experience and brains to bring the best thinking forward, and also as a tool to bring people along. Finally, because you're in this managerial place and the emotions of a manager have a strong ripple effect, there is a little bit more guardedness needed around how you show up, and in particular, the ability to behave in a calm manner to bring calm to the group when needed. So again, you're not shutting down all of your expression. You're just better able to balance when you express and when you're more reserved. What we need to turn down when we make this transition is, in the LEA language, it's production, for those of you who are wondering about the link. But for those of you who don't know the LEA, you have to turn down a little bit driving hard for ambitious results. Now, again, if you're not shutting it off, but what you're trying to do is add more tools to your toolkit, and that just setting really ambitious goals and demanding that people keep working hard to achieve them as a one-note leadership strategy is not the way to go. So you've got to back off a little bit of that and diversify your approach to leadership to really engage people to move forward. Being independent in thinking and action is one of the biggest transitions. You'll find in this transition, the hardest place is really helping that individual contributor not stay an individual contributor, not wanting to keep their own work, to think independently, to move through the work more independently. It's how do you help them open up the space to be inclusive of the people that they're managing and leading. And finally, as I mentioned before, as sort of the counterpart to being a little bit more cautious is, again, that push for innovation has to be a little bit more moderated. One of the challenges you see with individual contributors is, particularly as they're getting used to this more supervisory managerial role, is they keep running so far ahead of their pack that nobody's following them anymore. So they can't follow their thinking, they can't follow their ambition, they don't know what's happening. And so we're really coaching the individual contributor to not move any faster or farther than they are capable of taking their team along with them. So one of the things that I find we help individuals in this transition is being patient and taking their time and judging their success on their progress in bringing people along and helping them define success in a slightly different way than they did as an individual contributor. All right, so that's the first leap. So you can see it's a big first leap. You can see why some individual contributors who thought they were going to really like this supervisory role decide, I'd really like to go back to being an individual contributor. as coaches, many of you have probably heard something akin to, boy, I would really love my job if I didn't have to do any management. So that can be true for people who really have this almost an adrenaline rush for being that free agent and working really independently and working quickly and taking risks. This can be a very difficult transition, but it's very doable with some guidance. It's hard to do if people don't have support along the way. Okay, so let's talk about the next one. The next one is we have made the transition, and now we've got a group of first line managers who have been so successful that we now think of them as demonstrating high potential to move to the next level. And so as we'll see, the pattern continues that as you go from one level to the next, not only is there significant shifts that need to be made, but the magnitude of the change gets bigger. So where we saw 9 behaviors of the 22 change in that first transitional movement, now we see 11 of the 22 change. So you can draw the connection, right? It just gets harder to make the change. So once again, this person has developed a level of mastery and a level of admiration in this first line manager role. So they made it. And now people are saying, I think they might have what it takes to go to the next level. And once again, we're seeing this complex mix of adjustment that needs to be made, leaning in more to some of these behaviors and using them more frequently than you did in the first line manager role, and pulling back on another set of behaviors so that you're not overutilizing those behaviors in your toolkit. So let's take a quick look at what those are. So you remember that the do more in the individual contributor to first line supervisor included asking for and using input from others. Well, now we have middle managers who have managers as direct reports, right? So that you can imagine that more traditional pyramid structure where there are even now as a middle manager more people underneath you. So there's more complexity and there are less things you're going to be able to have a clear line of sight on. So you need to really rely on your ability to engage others and to build trust in you so that good, bad, or indifferent, the flow of information is coming to you, right? So it even increases more from that first transition. Because there's a broader span of control and usually work becomes more complex here, that the ability to communicate thoroughly and clearly, you need to spend more time with that. I think leaders are continually amazed at how much repetition, how many examples, how many different forms of communication are really required in order for those messages and knowledge and insight to really sink into the mind and the bones of the people they're communicating with. But I find myself reminding leaders all the time, we live in an extraordinarily noisy world where there is tons of information flowing in at any given time and lots of distraction. So the ability to communicate clearly and thoroughly and with a lot of repetition becomes more and more crucial as you go up into the more complex realms of leadership. Here we see for the first time the use of persuasion becoming more critical. So you are really asking people to do more, to do different, to translate more of the vision into action, and you really want to win people's hearts and minds. So being able to create a compelling story to draw people in becomes more critical. We see an increased importance in the use of empathy. So that at the middle management level, it becomes even more important to let people know that you care, that you see them as individuals. So more time spent really connecting with people so they feel seen, understood, and cared for. Even more need to delegate than you made in that first transition. Again, the goals that you have as a middle manager are bigger, larger, more diverse than you had as a first line supervisor. So really making sure you've got delegation down becomes really critical in this space. Now we see that thinking and planning more strategically becomes more critical. We actually see, if you've looked at our research, strategic is actually helpful all the way along the way, from individual contributor to senior leader. However, this transition really is the pivot point for strategic thinking and planning to be even more critical. First line supervisors, it's good to have a strategic line of sight on what you're doing and being able to connect what your team is doing to the broader organization. But middle management work starts to become much more critical in terms of really thinking about consequences and how we interact with other departments and how it supports where we're trying to go. So this is a pivot point for being able to be more strategic. Where do we need to be, turn it down a little bit? Actually being forceful and being assertive. You have to tone it down. One of the things that's really challenging for leaders, generally leaders walk through life thinking of themselves more as Trisha or Lucy or John or Sally, right? I'm me. But they don't realize that you are you plus your role. And as your role has more power associated with it, you have to pull back a little bit on personal power, because it can be kind of a double hit, right? Personally, your approach is very powerful and you have a powerful role, and it can overwhelm the people around you. For those of you who know some about neuroscience, that creates that dual power dynamic, creates a threat response in the brains of the people around you, making them less cognitively effective, which that is not the recipe for the kind of team and organization underneath you want. So you have to pull back a little bit on your personal forcefulness. You also have to continue, as you did in the last shift, pull back a little bit from itself in the LEA, for those of you who know the LEA, for those of you who don't, going off on your own and thinking and acting independently. Again, you have to be really careful about that for two reasons. One, you don't know what you don't know unless you really check out throughout the organization what the missing pieces of information are in your own matrix. The other thing is you need to bring people along. And so if you go off on your own and then just blindly ask people to follow, you miss that sort of creating that compelling thread that pulls them with you. You have to be less structured. So here's a little bit of a boomerang. As an individual contributor, you were less structured. You were more fluid in the way that you worked. You needed less structure in the way that you worked. As a first line supervisor, you needed to become more organized. You needed to be better about establishing processes and policies and rules and a structure so that there was, you were calming chaos and having your team work very efficiently. But as a middle manager, you need to back off, because that organizing really is in the realm of the first line supervisor. And if you are too structured in that middle management role, you are generally too far down in the weeds to really hold that middle management space. Here again, you have to moderate the use of production in the LEA or pushing for ambitious results. It's not that you are moderating the goal. You are moderating the behaviors you use to get the goal. So the do more is the how do I bring people along, right? How do I engage hearts and minds? How do I make them have a fire in their belly in order to stretch and reach for more ambitious results? So again, pushing for ambitious results is another power dimension. And so you want to have enough power to keep the engine going, but not so much power that you're overwhelming the team and creating that threat response. Now, remember another boomerang, right? When highly effective and high potential individual contributors don't defer as much to authority, again, acting a little bit more as a free agent. Now, then as a first line supervisor, you've got to turn that up a little bit and really see that you're part of that managerial structure in the organization. In a middle management role, you have to be able to sort of speak truth to power in that middle space, right? You're in that middle space where you're absorbing a lot from the senior space and you're understanding a lot from the more junior space. And so you need to be able to speak a little bit more directly and openly to people more senior than you in the organization. All right, we'll do the last one and then we'll pause for questions. So again, you're not going to be surprised, right? Making this change is the biggest change we make. Of the 22, we are now changing 14. This is the most challenging leadership transition. So much changes when we go into that senior management level, and we'll talk about that very specifically in just a moment. But from a behavior perspective, we're really looking at needing to increase 10 of the behaviors and pull back on 4 of them. So it's a very complex change in pattern. And remember, this superstar middle manager has been told, you are awesome. We think you're so ready for this change. And it's yes, but you have to lead in a very, very different way than you've been leading in this glorious place that you've been in as a middle manager in order to be successful at this next level. So a lot of these behaviors we've learned about, so I'll go over them quickly. Here again, we see turning up the volume on empathy. Remember, power increases that threat response. It increases the degree to which everybody is ready to hear what you have to say. I actually had a coaching session with a CEO today yesterday that said, one of the things I've learned in my years as a CEO is I can whisper a wonder and it ripples through the organization like it's a loud mandate. So in moving to this senior level, you have to hold your power, the position power, in an open way, so it doesn't overrun your intentions as a leader. So some of the ways we do that is, again, increase that empathy, increase the persuasion to be sure you're not only relying on mandates, but actually bringing people along. Further delegating. One of the big kisses of death for senior leaders is they don't have a robust organization underneath them in terms of capacity and capability. And so they end up having, I tell them they're like shorebirds, right? They're diving down into the water to pick up the fish at the lower levels. They have to delegate well, and they have to have a strong organization underneath them. Otherwise, they won't be able to stay at that senior management level. They have to now, where we had that reserve that came in that first line supervisor transition. Now people want to see a little bit more. They want senior leaders to be a little bit more transparent, and they want to know that senior leaders are invested and enthused, because if the senior leaders aren't invested and enthused, why should I be invested and enthused? Again, we're seeing each level up, there is an increasing need to ask for and use input from others. Otherwise, you get in that ivory tower space. And if you're not asking for feedback, you quickly end up being the emperor, empress without any clothes, right? So really having that looped kind of engagement where you're constantly asking people for their perspective, their point of view, their ideas, and their feedback. You have to take full responsibility for the leadership role. For those of you who know the LEA, it's management focus. You need to, it's the American phrase, right? The buck stops here. You need to, whatever happens in your area, ultimately it's your responsibility. So there's, kind of nobody to blame but me at this point, and you have to be willing to hold that. Again, to balance the sense of power that comes with your role, you need to be a little bit more engaged socially. You need to be able to be outgoing a little bit more, chat with people, be able to have some informal conversation so it's not always all business, so that you are seen as more accessible. You need to be able to provide really clear feedback. And this can be hard. We're dealing with a lot of organizational cultures right now, particularly in the humanitarian, healthcare, and nonprofit space, where there isn't a really strong feedback culture, which is not unusual in those sectors. And so sometimes we see people getting to the senior leadership level and they really haven't developed a very good practice around clear feedback. They're sort of either ignoring it or using coaching language or sending somebody else to give feedback. So this is often a strong coaching point when you've got a senior leader who has sort of delayed development in this space. So here's a very interesting cognitive thing about the last two under do more. They both, in LEA terms, need to be thinking more conservatively or traditionally if you're using the British English, and pushing for innovation. So they need to, and why is this? It's because when you're at the senior level, problems, issues, opportunities are more complex. And you need to be able to train yourself cognitively to look at both opportunity and innovation and run everything through the filter of what could go wrong, where is the risk, so that you can make more comprehensive recommendations, decisions, and offer up solutions, right? So it's that duality of the cognitive space. What do we need to do less of? So same as we are traveling from that middle to senior, less in that structuring space, less organizing that should be happening at lower levels. Obviously less deference to authority, because at this level, what often is authority is the CEO and the board, right? So you really need to be able to speak up and hold your space. Less in that tactical place. Again, if I don't have a strong organization underneath me as a senior leader, I end up diving down into that middle and sometimes even into that first line supervisor space. I also can do that because it comforts me, right? I feel really competent down here in this complex, no easy answer space up in senior leadership. I don't feel quite as competent. And then finally, in LEA speak, it's control. For the rest of us, it's tracking and monitoring the work, right? Where is this? Are we on target? Are we going to get to the right place? That's middle management work, and to some degree, first line supervisor work. And so you want that information bubbling up to you. You don't want, as a senior leader, to be the one who's running around trying to find it, right? So that can be a challenging transition, because a lot of middle management can be around this tracking and monitoring work. So really trusting others to do that can be quite a significant transition. So here's your easy access on map, and you can really see we're asking that transition to be more and more dramatic as we go along. So not only do we have to account for these shifts in terms of just the general expectations that shift, but the magnitude of the change is very significant. And we also have to remember, when people make these changes, they're expected to hit the ground running. And so it is so important from my perspective that they have coaching in these transitions to raise their awareness of the change that's actually required, because otherwise the way that they find out about the change is through repeated failure to make the change. And that becomes burdensome, not only in terms of reputation, but also in terms of motivation and energy for the role. So, Lucy, what do we have for?
We have such great questions coming in, and keep them coming, folks. If we don't get to them during this hour, we will definitely get to them in our follow-ups. So these are great. One from George says he's seen some middle managers who are making good team management progress and then have gone backwards due to COVID, like less delegation, more control. He says remote work becomes remote control. Your thoughts on that, and do we have any research on that?
So we are tracking the remote leader changes that are happening as remote leaders. We should probably have enough data, I'm guessing first quarter of 2022, to really make a good case for what we're seeing about what's changing as leaders become more remote. And what George, I think that's a really, we would echo that observation, and that observation tells us, our hypothesis is this, that the tracking and monitoring in that space and also the team connection in that space was so based on physical connection, the conversations in the hall, the conversations in the lunchroom, now that I have a line of sight on that, I wasn't anticipating that I was going to ask that question, but now that I have a line of sight on you, where are we with X? And so these patterns of creating connection across team and tracking and monitoring were not actually systematic. They were occasional, right? Based on the occasion of encountering people. And so I think our ability to help people strategically think about how you do that in a remote place is going to become increasingly more important, because I don't think I'm alone in thinking that this remote work's not going to go away. Should we take one more?
Sure. And then, yes, keep them coming, and we will definitely get to more beyond the broadcast or at the end. So how does the LEA measure the agility that's needed to make all of these big changes that we're talking about?
So we actually have an agility question on the LEA in terms of looking at the degree to which observers perceive these individuals as having demonstrating the ability to move from one to the other. We also measure resilience, which is essentially how quickly does the leader recover from a misstep or a backslide or something that doesn't work, which we think the two of those together are really important in ability to make this transition. I will also tell you that we know as a rule, there are a few behaviors, just like we know there are a few behaviors that tend to be helpful across a more universal set of circumstances. There are also overuse of some behaviors that get leaders more in trouble. And they are the behavior of self, which is being independent in your thinking and your action, going off too far on your own, right? They are also the behavior of structuring, spending too much time in the detail of being organized in the process. And we believe that's the overuse of that creates trouble in the leadership space, because you can't move fast enough to actually change. The third is dominant, which is overusing that forceful behavior. And the fourth is deference to authority, being too deferential to authority. So those speak about the ability to be agile in terms of self and other, the ability to be agile around process, the ability to be agile around moderating the use of power, and the ability to be agile in terms of when to defer to authority and when not. So I think that the underlying theme of the agility question is really important. All right, as Lucy said, I can tell you she's very, very diligent at making sure those of us who lead webinars answer all questions in the follow-up email. So I'm going to keep us going, but your questions will absolutely be answered, we promise. All right, so let's look at now the biggest transition, the most challenging transition, that transition from middle to senior, and how we can help these leaders be more effective in that transition. So let's do a quick poll and just get a sense for what your experience is. I'm going to share some research in this space, but in your experience, what percentage of leaders fail in the transition of senior leadership? And let's use fail broadly. Let's imagine over the 18 to 24 months that they just don't meet the level of success that was expected. So that can translate all the way to being let go or demoted, to really losing in the reputation area of, oh, we're keeping them on, but they really can't cut it. So what's your experience as you look at this transition of leaders becoming senior leaders? What percentage of leaders are failing to really do well in that transition?
Thanks, everyone. Just a moment in case anyone else wants to get a vote in. Yeah. And close that up, and let's
I always feel like we should have music, Lucy.
I know. Well, you're always good at a vamp, so maybe a little ditty next time.
All right, good. It's a nice, look at that. It's a nice bell curve. And I think it really depends upon where we are. And I think it depends a lot upon how well an organization does in developing leaders along the way. So we didn't have our own research in this space, so we went looking high and low, and it really depends upon where you look and how you define failure. But the most comprehensive study we found is from the Corporate Executive Board, and their study found, depending upon how you define failure and where you look, 50 to 70% of senior executives fail within the first 18 months. And that for them was anything from getting fired to just getting relatively poor performance appraisal about how they're doing in that space. So degree of success measured in that internal way. So why do so many senior leaders fail, or at least fail to translate the perception of their potential into effectiveness? So as we all know, some people are getting promoted who are never good leaders. They're good politically, or they have a special technical skill that's valued. So they never were a good leader. So of course, they're not going to be a good leader when it comes to being a senior leader. As we've seen, failure translates at every level, but often most significantly at the senior level, that I just keep leading the way I've always been leading and really don't understand what's required now that I'm at this level. Really, one of the biggest challenges, I think, at the senior level is the level of complication we're dealing with. We are at a place where, for much of what we're dealing with, there's no easy answers. There's also no slam dunk answers, meaning that if we could just find the right answer, it will be perfect all the way around. We're always looking at trade-offs. I'm dealing with regulators and vendors and politics and the board and the CEO, and now my peer relationships make an even bigger difference. And the organization underneath me is very large. And so the leap in terms of scope and scale from that middle to senior level is very substantial. And I think oftentimes people don't have an idea of what that is until they're there. Can't navigate the politics and stakeholders. So I just kind of did a roundabout of the stakeholders, but there's a lot going on in this space about, how you're cultivating alliances, how you're reading the signals that are being sent, how you understand who's more or less influential, how you're navigating changing landscapes inside and outside the organization. Middle managers have a little bit of this, but it grows exponentially at that senior level. One of the dynamics that happens here is ego can get in the way. I feel like I really know a lot. I've got a lot of experience. I've been very successful in my role. I'm here to teach more than to learn. And that's a huge mistake that senior leaders make. Senior leaders really need to make time to listen. They often need to be trained how to listen thoroughly, and they need to be able to, at one level, hold their confidence in what they know, but be curious and really want to not only learn more, but also to be open to the fact that what they think they know might not be wholly accurate. This use of power, I've mentioned it a couple of times. We see two different things that happen in this space. One, sometimes, as I said before, I just see myself as Trisha, and so don't understand that what comes with the power and the role, I have to be more careful about how I speak, what I say, how I show up, because I'm not just Trisha. I am Trisha with the power that comes in this senior role, and that magnifies everything and can really add to confusion and or threat. We also see people go the other way, right? This, on this power trip, and without recognizing that by trying to maximize the power and authority they have, that they're really creating a highly threat-sensitive environment, which really diminishes people's cognitive capacity to do good work, to navigate through complexity, to solve problems, to think in new and innovative ways. So really navigating the complexity of power at this level can be a real issue. And then finally, we see leaders really not understanding the culture. Of course, this happens with senior leaders who come in from the outside. That's one of the biggest reasons that leaders fail coming from the outside, is an organ rejection based on a bad cultural match. But the second thing that happens is we see people who have come up through the organization but lose perspective when they get up at that senior level. Many of you know we have a leadership culture assessment, and we, when we do that work, either with a network member in support of their clients or direct clients who work with us, we cut that data in all different ways. And one of the traditional ways is to cut by level. And I will tell you, the senior leadership team always has the most distorted view of the culture within the organization, because at that level, they have more information and they have more agency. And so they look at what's possible through that lens, and it distorts their perspective of what it feels like to be in the organization and the rest of the space. All right, so great, lots of stuff. What do we do? Well, there are basically three major categories that we can help leaders in making this transition. The first is really coaching them around both how they think and how they communicate, because they really need to be able to think more broadly. They need more thinking time. They need the ability to take in more information and really to be able to process all that information. They need to be able to, as I said before, ask good questions and really, really listen. And they need to pause before they speak. They need to be intentional about the way that they communicate, right? They need to recognize what life is like at the executive floor, even if there's literally no executive floor. There are some real complex things that need to happen at this space. The organization is looking at them. And again, if they don't look confident, like they believe in the organization and like they know what they're talking about, everybody else gets nervous, right? So how do we help them hold that space? How do we help them focus on, I'm the CIO, so I have to really care about technology, but now I really have to focus on the whole organization, and I need to know how I fit in with everything else, right? I need to have a much clearer understanding that my responsibility now is not just my area. I am now a part of the team that is responsible for the entire organization. We've talked about this, how people pay attention to avoiding the emperor empress without any clothes, and really asking for feedback and really tracking themselves around the degree to which they're creating a space where people feel safe to be able to come to them with things. They need to be much more intentional about the culture they're creating. I have senior leaders write their leadership manifesto. If you're interested in seeing the questions I use for that, just stick it in the Q&A. We'll make sure you get it. Actually, Lucy, let's just send it so people have it. We'll send it with the follow-up information.
Sure.
And then finally, the other thing here is there is no way a senior leader can actually accomplish everything that's on their plate. Probably true for many all the way up the organization journey, but it becomes even bigger now. So the ability to prioritize that urgent and important dynamic and to really build the skills, because prioritization has to happen on a regular basis. Finally, the really attending to relationships, not only with yourself, but relationships with others. At this level, peer relationships become more critical than they ever have been. Together with my peers, I am responsible for this whole organization. And so it can no longer be just a casual connection and I have some closer relationships with some peers than others. I need to build strong peer relationships across my whole peer community. I need to be able to create psychological safety. I need to create an environment where people feel safe to speak up, because bad things happen when bad news is not communicated up to the most senior levels. And bad news will not be communicated if people feel unsafe, right? I need to be a very strong developer of people. If my part of my organization is not fully staffed with the right people and the right amount of people, I cannot stay at the senior level. So I need to make sure I've got a good staff and they are growing and learning so I can stay at that senior level. Finally, this may not be everybody's coaching style, but I ask people and coach them around centering practices. For some people, it's prayer. For some people, it's meditation. For some people, it's time in nature. For some, it's mindfulness. For some folks, it's gratitude journaling. But what is the practice or practices they use to bring their mind and body back into a calm, centered space so they can act with wisdom and intention, not through fear and or anger and or reaction? So really critical all the way along the way, I think, as leaders, but especially critical at this top level. So we would say, there are three buckets as practitioners that we need to be helping leaders with. It will not surprise any of you that we really think assessments are critical. We think motivational assessments are critical because we have to help people maximize their energy. And if they are leading in a way that's not consistent with things that energize them and ways that energize them, then they're going to run out of steam and they're not going to be able to make the transition successfully. So we as coaches can help them map their motivational energy to the way that they're leading. They need a multi-rater assessment. As they go up the ladder, we move from talking about leadership in general to leadership based on stakeholders. Nowhere is that more important than as a senior leader. We have to really talk about how you're showing up as a leader with your boss, how you're transitioning your leadership with your peers, and how you're leading your direct report and the organization underneath you. They need it for that level of clarity. They need it to identify their blind spots, and they need it to get really accurate feedback about how they're perceived. Because in general, these are people who are used to being successful. So sometimes their ability to perceive the way that they're acting through the lens of others is compromised. It will come as no surprise to you that we are strong believers in coaching for these transitions. There's so much that people have to work on, that the ability to help them focus so they're not running all over the place, but really focusing on where it makes a difference. And of course, coaching provides a really important, safe, but accountable space. Also, I mean, these folks are dealing with a high level of complexity and some amount of fear in making these transitions. So insight and support and some guidance can be really helpful. And then really helping train these leaders in transition to not try to be heroes and pretend that transition is something other than it is, which is a big, steep learning curve. So guide them in asking for feedback so that they can get insights, but insights that are relevant for that just-in-time space about what do people need from them and how can they be more helpful. And also, if we train leaders to ask for feedback on an ongoing basis in a constructive way, they're modeling the way. And so throughout the organization, this idea of reaching out and asking for feedback, so we're building this more robust, healthy feedback culture can be really, really important. So this is not an easy journey, this transition from one step to another, even when we're dealing with the most successful people. But with very specific guidance and knowledge about what is required, we can help them get there. And most of them want to get there, and so they just need the map and they need the support. So I know we don't have time for questions, so I see that there are a lot in. I absolutely promise you we will send those answers along with the resources. And Lucy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes. So thanks everyone so much for joining us. I know we are right at the end of the hour. Yes. Look out for the slide deck and everything coming up and extra resources, a few things Trisha mentioned as well. And then we have a number of upcoming events. So we have a workshop next week. If you're certified in LEA, you can join us for that. We still have a few spots left. Certifications we have scheduled into next year. So you can start signing up for those if you're not certified in our tools. And then our next season of webinars and workshops will be announced very soon. But in the meantime, we have, and many of you may know this, we have a huge on-demand library of resources. So those are available to you at any time. And if you're an MRG partner, if you're certified with us, you can just hop into the knowledge base and search and go wild in there with hundreds of resources. And then for folks who aren't necessarily certified with us yet, mrg.com, there's also a research library there where you have some downloads and you have some options for things that you might want to check out. A sampling of our resources are available to you there as well. And I believe that's all we have. So thanks everyone so much for joining us. If you are looking for your credits for SHRM certification, if you're looking for continuing ed, I'll put that in the chat now, or just shoot us a quick email if you don't happen to catch it. And I believe that's all we have. So everyone, thank you again so much for joining us. We will get to your questions, and we will see you next time. Looking forward to it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks all.